So the only topic so far is some continued discussion about how to do a proxying filter in Zypper. This is intended to fit in beneath D4N. There was a lot of discussion in the D4N meeting yesterday that didn't quite get resolved. So I was hoping we could continue that here, although if Matt's not here, then I would prefer him to be present.
Matt's in the program meeting.
Topics before we start? Dan, did you have something on the proxy?
I was just saying Matt's in the program meeting.
I see, thanks. All right, well, I think we should probably reschedule that discussion. What else? How about how's Reef looking for you guys? Are there things features that we need to finish, or important fixes that haven't merged yet?
I mean, I have a bunch of work that is kind of in the pipeline for tautology. But I mean, I guess Reef would have to wait until tautology is back in shape anyway, so.
Any update on that while you're how we're at it?
Seems like it's trending in the right direction, right?
What does that mean? Is it doing work but just full of queue is full?
Think so.
So I had a fix for the ragweed issue earlier today and managed to get 2 jobs through. I just scheduled single jobs at P50 and they ran in a timely fashion.
All righty.
Who knows what'll happen if you schedule a full suite, but the ragweed failures are gone, so things look promising. So Matt, we were waiting to discuss the S3 proxying stuff until you joined. Are you still in the program call, or are you available?
No, I have dropped out of the program call. Hopefully all will be well.
All right, cool. Well, Dan or Matt, would you guys like to summarize kind of what we talked about yesterday and where we left off?
Yeah, go ahead. You want to start and as best we can, or I can if you can.
So we discussed how the Zypper API is not very good for S3 proxying because it breaks S3 ops up into lots of little API calls. The obvious way to good S3 proxying is to proxy at the op layer, but that puts it above Zypper, which means it can't be used when in a Zypper stack. I don't think we came to any conclusion as to how to solve this problem.
Yeah, there was also a lot of discussion on how auth fits into this. Like what can we do in verify permissions if we don't have access to bucket echoes and policy and stuff?
Well, yeah. I don't think that was the intent of Zypper to sort of to strictly mirror Rados does, but it was a way to get things going, and it proved useful for enabling a couple of independent drivers, and maybe four, as many as four. I think there should be a model where we can build something like the S3 filter and not lose the ability to treat it like a storage backend in some way. When you say don't have anything didn't make it come to a firmware. They certainly haven't come to a firmware designed for that, but I don't think that Zipper is intended to be strictly relying on, for example, groveling on attributes, and thereby sort of leaking what I think are sort of Rados abstractions upward. And there might need to be some way to unify that. It's an acceptable leakage for obviously some backends, but
so as like a storage interface, it's more about like reading things from the backend and writing them back, and that's very different from what we're looking for a proxy filter, right? Because it essentially can't read things into memory.
Well, I agree with that, but we made something we did kind of agree on, or at least I think the progress was made in the discussion that the notion that we just want to do proxying and kind of tunnel requests across is not, it's probably not the case. That's not what at least D4N is trying to do with S3. But yes, so that's correct. In some other way, yes. We want the ops that we would be passing through the stack are don't. It's currently designed. Yeah, doing verified permissions by looking at local information or locally cached information is not the intent. And being coerced to doing that, doesn't really work.
So my thinking on this is that maybe we don't actually want it to be a zipper abstraction, but we want to build a new abstraction for use by D4N and potentially other things that looks a lot more op oriented, that's easier to proxy that way. And I know there's interest in D4N being able to use other zipper stores like Rados or otherwise for its cache, but maybe the op-oriented interface would map pretty easily to a zipper store in that case. But for the S3 proxy, it would be its own implementation.
Like,
do you understand what I'm saying?
Not quite. So I understand how you're saying that. If you wanted to build like an S3 proxy, like S3 Mirror, or that framework that was contributed, but like, what do you mean by the way D4N would use S3 being amenable to being a zipper store and the other usage not be? I'm interested in that, and I'm interested in how the one that would match up would work, or maybe I'm misunderstanding what you're saying. As long as if there's a different interface, but that interface can consume zipper backends, that may also, or at least sorry, D4N needs to consume zipper backends, but D4N needs the ability to read and write on S3. It may not care whether that interface is self-similar to zipper.
Right. I'm essentially proposing some backend interface for D4N. We can implement that with an S3 proxy, and then we can have a different implementation that uses a zipper store to do the reads and writes.
I understand part of that. What does the last part mean? Like we have it. Like you didn't. I understand the first part. Like I understand. Okay, so we have an interface that lets a zipper filter like D4N, for example, lets it write or read objects onto S3. That just becomes maybe its own thing. Is that fair? It's a zipper filter. It knows that it authorizes the request coming in, and when it needs to store something or retrieve something, it uses something that isn't zipper. Is that like
yes.
the first part?
Yes.
Okay.
Right, for all of the things where it's like writing things out to cache, it's not just mimicking zipper APIs. It can use an interface that's a lot more like operation oriented. That's a better fit for the proxy.
And it can hide those within whatever phases it wants.
Yeah.
Whatever makes sense. Okay, that sounds cogent. What are the next parts? Could you drill into the other part?
Well, right. So one of the targets for D4N's, I guess it's the caching layer that it wants to proxy to S3. Is that the right terminology?
Well, this newer
Which is
thing
the cache
that
and which
Aran.
is the backend.
Well, yeah. Well, I'm not sure. I mean, Aran and the students brought in like at the end of last year, or maybe sometime last year, this a use for the S3 filter where they just kind of want to proxy a large number of things, but then they want to prototype new behaviors in the middle somehow. I don't know if that's quite the same as it's not what D4M was originally doing, and I'm not exactly sure if it isn't doing if it isn't sort of a magical design. Proxying is one thing, but then how do you then do more? It may be a foundering on the conflict between the two things.
Right. Well, I mean, D4N itself is a filter on top of some other store, which is its backend storage. And then it would have a separate interface for the things that it proxies to S3 or some other cache layer.
I mean, right. I mean, in the end, what I would like us to have out of D4M would be the ability for that filter to dispatch onto different kinds of storage backends or other stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
And yes, and whatever flexibility it needs there.
Right. That's why we wanted to use a zipper API for that also. But I think it's just too much of a stretch to do S3 through that. So I'm just proposing that we have a different one.
Now, what would that other interface do? I mean, like I understand. I can understand. That would be the S3 would be something. I mean, what I think I heard earlier was that the S3 interface would be wrapped up under something else. But are you saying that D4N wouldn't be a zipper filter either?
No, it still would be.
Okay.
But instead of using a zipper abstraction to talk to S3, it would use a new abstraction.
Okay, but it uses and it would use zipper abstractions to talk to things that fit zipper.
Right, we would have an implementation of that abstraction for S3, and then we would have a separate implementation that did it in terms of a zipper backend instead.
So I'm wondering about that because the API up from D4N would be zipper. And so all of the broken apart into little pieces had already happened. And so how do you consolidate that back down into an op-based API that it calls down?
So zipper as a filter can already pass things to its own backend store, and that's different than what we want in S3, right?
So all I'm saying is,
imagine. Okay, I think I get what you're saying.
So D4N gets a call that says, get adders on a bucket, right? It needs to translate this into something in S3. How does it do it? Because it doesn't have the op at that point. It has the specific get adders call on the bucket, right? Because it's a zipper filter.
It would have to have its own storage, which is the store that it's filtered on top of. And that's where all of the calls would go. It's only when D4N wants to operate on the other S3 level. I still don't know if that's the cache or not, but those would have to hook into like the getObj or the data read abstractions, and we would translate those into a getObj operation on this.
Okay, so you're severely limiting the S3 API to just data.
Yeah.
Okay, so then there's no reason you couldn't do that as a zipper filter. It's just that S3 has to be on top of whatever other store holds the real data, and it just intercepts the data stuff and does with it right? Which is how we're developing it now. Because I mean, you've already just limited it to the zipper calls for data, and so you're just going to implement the zipper calls for data.
Well, sometimes D4N is going to pass calls on to its own next layer, and sometimes it's going to redirect to the cache.
Right.
I mean, yeah.
And if the only calls that it sends to the cache are the data-oriented calls, which is what I believe you said, then it can do that via Zipper API just as easily as some other API.
Well, not strictly, but some of them. So, like when it wants to be able to reproduce head request, respond to head requests, which have attribute information wherever it came from, user-defined attributes at least, and ditto for data.
I mean, the issue is, right, what I'm misunderstanding, I think, is that once we've broken the op calls down into zipper calls, we can't recreate the original op calls, right? And so we have to then be doing a subset of actual S3 ops based on the zipper calls.
Well,
and at that point, you can do it via the Zipper API. You just implement only those calls. I don't see how it's.
Hold on a second. If the Zipper API knows.
So my point is, I think for S3 to be a more op-oriented API, D4N also needs to be that more op-oriented API, and not Zipper.
That's possible, but I also sort of think, well, that would work. I mean, to be fair, my Zipper's interface. Zipper was always conceived by me, at least, as being a kind of an. And I think its name implies that it was, but when we talked about it in general terms before we typed all of it, that it's sort of an interlocking piece below the op layer. And I always assumed that it knew something about ops. So that makes them, but as it developed, it's not, it doesn't exactly have. So maybe I'm not sure whether that's strictly necessary or not. But if it allowed op information into calls, then for example, Zipper code, Zipper filter code could or store backend code could understand basically what it was doing, and it could more easily. I don't know if I remember what the right term is, but more easily mask, more easily report respond to the upper layer in a way that allowed it to continue basically until it got to the point where it wants to do whatever it's going to do. But I think I'm not sure that's really maybe we need an audit of what Zipper is doing and see whether. My intuition just tells me that the way we're consuming a few things, a few aspects of the Zipper layer, especially attributes, is just to.
So why aren't attributes a generic thing? I mean, that seems excessively generic to me. They're just user-defined attributes that get stored. That seems like the most generic possible of APIs. What's wrong with that? I mean, I'm trying to understand, because of all the things in Zipper API, attributes were the last thing I would expect to be a problem, right?
Well, Well, the issue is that the way Zipper is working now, Zipper looks like a VFS, like that. It is VFS in the sense. I mean, but I mean the op layer is doing things like looking at the attributes to decide whether it should, what the permission stop on this object are or something, and instead that only works if we're storing, if we sort of have control over.
So I think I'm with Dan here. The only correction that I would offer is that it's not really user-defined attributes, it's RGW-defined attributes. And so there's a mismatch between what RGW wants to store versus what we would store in S3, right?
Well, yes, but then I think I'm saying the same thing. But we've given semantics to those structures, and that's a leakage. That's a leakage from Rados, or some other backend we could have written that looks like Rados.
I don't think it's a leakage. It's an abstraction.
I mean, all of these attributes are created and stored above the line, right? They're not created within Rados store or anything like that. These are all op layer attributes, right? If the problem is that the namespace is conflated with the actual user attributes, then maybe we need a separate namespace for them. But this is a generic data store that the op layer is making use of to store its generic data. And maybe that generic data needs to look like something else. I mean, clearly the data types that we are storing in these things came from Rados. There's no question of that, right?
Well,
but these are data that we created above the line and stored above the line and are checking above the line and using above the line.
Well, the utility of Zipper was supposed to be that we could actually implement useful filters, and in order for Zipper to proceed that way, I mean, that has to be true. It has to be possible to usefully virtualize.
There are a lot of useful filters here, but S3 isn't really a storage interface. It's a op interface, right? It's the whole thing. And so it's just a big mismatch between what we're accomplishing with Zipper and what we need.
Well, I don't know. I mean, maybe that's true, but then there's an interface we need that looks like that. There are a couple of interfaces. Well, let's look at the deep. Let's what we went from. Maybe that's true, but I hope that the D4N filter itself makes sense. I mean, let's say you are if D4N wants to be able to be above other stores, and it wants to be able to redirect accesses for data and attributes are presented as S3 results back up to clients. If I want to make sure that if we, that's still the case, that Zipper is suitable for that. If not, then D4N itself, which is one of our main goals, needs to be a different interface. Conversely, separately or collaterally, I mean, D4N wants to be able to store and retrieve basically objects, and it doesn't care about ops, but except insofar as that makes the workflow work for D4N. So and D3N the same. So we want to be able to say, well, the subject is in cache and go get it from there with its attributes. Go do a head on it there, or go check the data, the other cache information and decide whether we should store it in cache or whether we should rewrite it somewhere else. And it wants to be able to do those things on various backends. It again, yeah, it doesn't that doesn't require that actually isn't based on S3 ops. It's based on get input and delete and maybe list.
Well, I mean, yeah, those are ops. They're not as granular as the.
They're not S3 ops.
They're
not S3. They're not S3 ops. They're a highly generic CRUD. And in some sense, they Daniel's sentence about what Zipper does is exactly suitable. I mean, Zipper isn't just. The problem is that Zipper and the S3 ops have workflows that are creating tension, I think. But Zipper can definitely be used to virtualize CRUD, and so we ought to be able to hide S3 ops on that somehow.
I mean, the problem here is that Zipper is not designed to allow you to do a subset of its API. And the S3, as it currently, as we're currently talking about it, seems to only want to be able to do a subset of the Zipper API.
Can you repeat that, please? I missed.
The S3 store, as we're currently talking about it, seems to only want to do a subset of the Zipper API. It wants to do reads, it wants to do writes, it wants to do multi-part objects, and that's about it.
That okay? Right? I buy that.
But the Zipper is not designed to be able to work that way. You cannot have that without you cannot do it without also having bucket objects and user objects, right? And all this other CRUD that has to exist in memory because the op layer uses that memory.
But I always assumed that the consumer of like the S3 layer would present user and bucket handles appropriate to doing the operation. Not that they would always be sort of flowing through from above all the time. I assumed that it would impersonate those things in some cases. Maybe always in the case of like users.
So this is, I mean, okay. So it's not impossible to do that, but the way Zipper is currently implemented, all of these flow from the bottom and not from the top.
I guess what I'm really saying is maybe we're all saying this different versions of the same thing. If we're
implementing S3 as a filter, it has to have all these things because we have to be able to run it and use it and test it.
Okay.
Right. And so if we really want to have all of these things impersonated by the layer above S3, then we need to stop working on S3 and finish D4N before we can work on S3.
Well, that might be appropriate.
Because there isn't a layer above S3 right now to be able to do any of this impersonation.
It's also true that the truth is another way of like saying, or kind of a companion statement to that is, or maybe it's circling back to what D4N needs. D4N needs to do CRUD on a couple of backends. It doesn't need for them to be all conformant with full Zipper.
Yeah.
Right, but something must be conformant with full Zipper.
Well, sure, but I mean,
and so
there's so many variables that I'm losing track here. But I know that I see two paths. They both come from Mass Open Cloud, and our project is more. I'm mostly interested not in S3 proxying, although Ron's become interested in that. But I'm interested in making D4N work and making D4N excellent. And so I need the ability to interpose something that allows us to do what D4N did upstream, but do it in a manageable, extensible manner. Sorry, go ahead, Casey.
Yeah, I'm just thinking it might help if we talk through an example for like a get obj request and try to trace it through the Zipper or through the D4N filter and figure out where it goes, right?
Yeah, exactly. So
we get a get request. D4N first wants to check the directory to see whether it's in cache, right?
Yeah, and we can expand on that, but yeah, exactly. It's in for the simplest case, it's in cache or not in cache, and if it's in cache, it's over here or it's over there.
And the directory, I think, is storing like the head object attributes. So we could potentially serve stuff out of that without even going to.
That's an extra detail, but it could do. Right? It shouldn't be required to have, right? And I mean, in the simplest model, it ought to be able to say, consult. The directory is a place where the decision, or at least state required by the caching algorithm tells us whether it is resident, whether it should be resident, and if for either of those, where. And it needs to be able to redirect. And it could, in addition to that, it could be we could optimize it various ways.
Okay, so if it's a cache miss, then D4N is just going to forward to its own next layer, right?
Yeah, I
to
agree.
its own backend.
That's
But
what they
if
should do.
it's
Whenever
a-
that backend is, it should be able to go get it.
All right, but if it's a cache hit where I guess we need to fetch attributes or data, then we would have to send a HTTP request to do that. I'm not exactly sure where in the Zipper API that would happen.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, this and you've been sucked into the weird inversion of the cache hierarchy that D4N imposes. But if it's a cache hit, it's over
Yeah.
here. If it's a cache hit, if it's a cache miss, it's over there. Either way, those are self-similar. We're getting the thing and presenting it.
Is that just for objects, or is that for metadata like buckets and users and everything else?
I don't know if we've ever sorted through that because D4N doesn't actually impersonate any of the or articulate those things right now.
So it sounds like all of the metadata stuff is just going to come from D4N's backend anyway. Do you agree, Dan?
With a caveat. So the cached version of the object has to have all of the data and metadata for that object. Otherwise, you're going to have to call into the normal backend anyway, and there's no point in using the cache.
But that is the expectation of D4N.
Except that we're talking about S3 being the cache layer, and it doesn't provide that.
Okay, you're
doesn't.
right. So
Hold on a second. When for metadata, but that's what the definition of metadata is. Defined as CRUD that contains an object that could be here or over there, which could be S3. Then yes, it does.
Metadata means everything necessary to create the SAL object that can be used by the upper layers.
right,
So that's a divergence between that's a tension between what Zipper wants and what D4N wants.
right. This goes back to the authorization layer also, because we need to be able to decide whether to accept or deny a request based on that metadata currently.
I mean, I still think that's a red herring, right? I think D4N can just stub all that out with default accept and pass it
If
through.
that's true, then that's a huge win. If that's a huge step forward, if that's possible. We always assumed that would be possible. I mean, that's been sort of how I imagined it all worked. That it could fake up that cache layer could fake up things and make the workflow eventually continue.
Okay,
Somehow.
so it skips auth, checks the directory, and if it's a cache miss, then it has to implement the auth against its next store.
Even if it's a cache hit,
Correct.
effectively.
Well, no, if it's a cache hit, it just passes through because it's S3
Well-
and it'll do its own auth.
I want us to. I know. I'm not trying to make it harder, but I'm trying to preserve the mental model here, where D4N has a set of strategy, has a strategy that where it can do different things. It shouldn't be biased towards thinking that Rados is local and or not local or something. So if the data is in Rados, then it has to be able to use Rados. We treat that as magical because it's our thing. But if the data is in Memcached here, if the data is in S3 or whatever, it has to go get that with whatever mechanism that for authorization that thing has.
Right.
And I agree that S3 looks special because it has user authentication that we want to preserve, if at all possible. I mean, if not, it'd be kind of shitty.
Well, it's also special because you never want to send more than one HTTP request in service of a specific app, right? So we don't want to separate.
I prefer to. We would strongly prefer that. Yes.
Well, I would say that that's required for correctness, because you could race with other overrides.
Yeah, okay. In terms of S3 itself, yeah, it is. I mean, you're right. I mean, because we're not. I mean, and no one's actually proposed. Well, I don't know. D4N itself has no cache invalidate mechanism, but on S3. But you could argue that that's broken. It's a temporal cache at best right now. But I don't disagree with you. I mean, what you're saying is the most correct, way we could do it. But we could probe and get attributes or something with a get app. But you'd have to factor in that that it could be different the next time you. I don't know how that hasn't even been thought through by D3N, to be honest, or D4N.
Yeah, I'm still not sure how we could make sense of authorization inside of the zipper stack, though. So,
well, zipper should be. I mean, I think we made progress on that yesterday. I mean, zipper should be. Well, the D4N driver should be deciding whether it wants this request to succeed, whether it wants to make the attempt to go get or go put or go list data.
right, but I think it also has to guarantee that whoever it sends the request onto is going to do auth checks, right? So S3 obviously is, because it's a whole new request. But if it's going to another backend, that wouldn't do auth by default, right?
Well, it all depends, but some of them will and some of them won't, and S3 is the one that will. I mean, we presumed yesterday too that there'd be some credential mapping, so we presumed that we are going to impersonate somebody, or whatever. We're going to select some S3 credential that we expect to work, but it may not, and go do whatever the op is. Thus far, yes.
Right. I'm thinking about more along the cases where the backend is a Rados cluster or a DB store or something that currently expects auth to happen in the app layer instead.
Well, but I mean, at that point, then you just don't fake up the default accept. You just actually use the real data, and then the actual auth check happens correctly in the first case.
D4N can't. Are you saying that D4N has to check the cache directory before it can decide whether or not to do auth on the top level?
Sure.
Okay.
Because it has to know what backend it's authenticating to. And that it may have different results based on what authentication backend it has, right? I mean, it may have, suppose it has 4 different stores, right? And, 2 caches, and different users have different access to different combinations of stores and caches.
Okay.
Credible to me.
I could see that working.
Yeah, my assumption was always that D4N would look it up in the cache at the very creation of the object itself and before anything else happens. The very creation of the SAL object itself and before anything else happens.
Okay, that's
in a
a
way,
promising direction.
And the way Zipper is set up right now, it has to, because the stack of blah 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 that results in that SAL object has to know ahead of time which branch to call down to create the correct, object. You can't swap around stacks midstream for an object the way it's currently designed, and that would be work to enable that.
Yeah. Okay. No objection to that.
So you still think that the S3 proxy could be a full zipper implementation?
So the S3 proxy could be a zipper implementation, but not one that could be used except underneath D4N or some other front end that knows.
But that's okay. That may be okay.
So it's not a generic filter that can be used anywhere.
Oh, it's okay with us.
One that can be used under specific other filters that know what it is and how to behave with it.
So Iran and Amin had this other project to proxy filter stuff, and they may have to redesign that in a way that's compatible with something that works.
Okay.
You said that would be a different API, probably, maybe, but it could be something that consumes Zipper and in that way is extensible.
I mean, backing up a step, I still think we could do a full S3. There would be a lot of HTTP ops, right? It would be slow.
Slow and, as Casey says, weird.
Yeah, I don't. It's hard for me to imagine an actual use case for that. As long as we
I mean, the use case
require,
would be testing it by itself, right?
right, but I think it's okay to only implement the pieces that a D4N would need and just stub everything else out with like return not supported or return null pointer.
Yeah. Is a mean here, by the way?
No.
I don't think so. We'll have to carry this water carefully, but yes. I mean, in the first instance, we want D4N to work, and I think Mass Open Cloud does too. If we have to start with one model and make it work, I think it should be that model.
So is S3 as the cache D4N? Like that's a requirement of it, or is it just any backend that can function as a cache? Maybe
Well,
the S3 thing is just
to me, it's number 2, and the S3 is got to be one way it can work. If they want to put a particular cache hierarchy, they call it the cache. If they want to put that in S3, D4N does that today. I think that's backwards.
It's horribly backwards. I mean, considering considering an S3 to be a local fast cache and a Rados to be a remote slow cache.
But I agree. Yes, mathematics and all of computer engineering agrees with us. But it shouldn't. But computer science says we can, or programming says we can make them abstractions that can be stacked any way we want. They can be a graph.
Yeah. I mean,
so I propose going there and not fighting them.
Okay, I think this picture is making sense to me.
Thank goodness. Guys, scared me a little.
I still have some unanswered questions about exactly what the zipper read and write paths look like and how we would map those both to HTTP requests and to the D3N work that Preetha's working on.
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely unanswered questions that we won't be able to figure out until we actually start working on it, I think.
Well, the D3N piece is kind of convergent, right? So it's the same problem, I think. If we actually are going to have a D3N filter, it's solving the same problem, and it better solve it the same way, more or less, I think.
I mean, the D3N, it doesn't need S3, right? So it can just use full zipper for everything and be done.
Well, can it? Okay, yes. Well, it can as long as but it needs its local cache.
Well, yeah, but we're writing a positive driver for that, and so that'll be fine.
Okay, whatever you say. I mean, whatever driver we want, however we want to wrap that, that's fine with me. I mean, it's its own libio thing today. I don't think it needs to converge with the file driver, but I mean, but it's similar.
But my point is, we will have 3 different stores that provide access to local disk.
Agreed, and then they can have the same interface.
It ought to be able to use one. So.
Okay, fine.
And yes, we should make whichever one we need to use as good as its current libAIO stuff for its purposes. But
I don't know. I don't think that. Well, maybe it's possible to make a subdriver. I don't know, to use a subset of one driver. I don't think it should be necessary for the POSIX file driver and this data cache thing to be the same. It doesn't. The cache driver doesn't need. It's an object store. It just needs get put, and it needs some other stuff like error correction and junk like that. To me, POSIX doesn't give us those things, and it also doesn't consume those things. So I think they're different.
I mean, if we're going to start having lots of drivers that are different than the zipper API, that's going to make things really complicated.
Well, I was saying earlier that I think there's a role for CRUD. And if that could be a subset of zipper, that would be ideal, because then it'd be easy to type one. I thought that's what you kind of got when you had when like a store driver inherited from something generic that provided the basic stubbed out operations.
I mean, there isn't anything generic to inherit from that provides stubbed out operations.
Maybe there's some way to conform.
DB store is currently that thing.
Okay. Maybe there's some way to design that and make everything sort of converge.
I mean, maybe. The thing is that you can't just stub everything out because stuff has to be there because the op layer calls it and uses it.
Well, if not, then I've said this before. And if that's not if not, then a simpler API that lets you do CRUD would be worth it. Would be useful to D4N and trivially D3N. You want a rich layer that lets you implement things like Rados and backends and potentially the D4N layer itself. But when D4N just needs to punch down and pop up and things, then I don't think that necessarily. Maybe it's more efficient to think of that as a smaller interface. I don't know if that's something that Casey had already said, but maybe I'm thinking of it differently. I think that's a narrower interface and not hard, and it doesn't have all those objects.
Yeah, that's where I was going initially, but yeah, I'm still not sure.
I think it makes sense because I'd like to be able to say you can build one of these cache backends and in a weekend, and I think we could make an interface to let you do that.
Yeah, I still feel like the hardest part to get started is going to be adapting our existing read and write APIs in Zipper to fit both the cache and this proxy idea, but maybe working with Preetha just on the D3N side and getting that working with the existing cache backend would be a good start, and then we could add, whatever abstraction we need out of that.
I like that. I think that goes in the right direction.
All right. Any other thoughts here? It's been almost an hour. About time to wrap up. Any other last minute topics before we call it? Well, thanks everybody for coming. I think this was really productive.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, man.
See you guys later.